Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event hosted by the Baltic Program at the Center for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. My name is Donatas Kopčiūnas. I'm a Baltic Fellow here at the Center, and today we will be discussing a very interesting book by Joel Berk called Rebooting a Nation, The Incredible Rise of Estonia, E-Government and the Startup Revolution, which was published by Hearst this year. Joel Berk is a technologist and Georgetown University alumnus based in Washington, D.C. He has advised startups and governments. He was also a research fellow at FP21, which is a think tank focused on transforming the process and institutions of U.S. foreign policy. And he was also an AI fellow in the U.S. Senate, and he led a team for the Republic of Estonia's e-residency program. Now, Joel's book is about how a poor post-Soviet country with a few natural resources was able to build one of the most advanced digital governments in existence in only one generation. Estonia, as we know, became home to the most startups per capita in Europe. It's an e-government leader. It was ranked first on the UN Global Services Scoreboard for 2022, as 99% of government services there are digitized. It's also the land of tech unicorns such as Skype. And so Joel will take us through this evolution from Estonia to Estonia. So Joel, over to you, the incredible rise of Estonia.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Let me quickly share my screen here. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen? Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. So you'll probably be wondering why it is that a American guy is speaking to you about Estonia. So I just wanted to quickly run through my background in a little bit more depth. So I started my career in early stage tech in the Bay Area. I was an early employee at a YC and Andreessen-backed company. And then I went out to Berlin to run a firm for Rocket Internet, which is somewhere in between a venture capital fund and a private equity firm and a company builder, all kind of mushed into one. But I was running a small tech startup for them, and I wanted to do something more impactful. So I found something called e-residency, which was billed as a startup within the government, and I had never heard of such a thing before. And I thought the concept of a startup within the government was quite fascinating. So I packed my bags from Berlin and moved over to Tallinn. This was in 2018. And so there I led business development. And what that meant is that I managed basically the growth and partnerships for the program, as well as a small team. So I had an employee in Ukraine, as well as some folks in India who we worked with, and was responsible for interfacing with, for instance, the United Nations or PayPal, important partners for both the country and the program. And then I had signed a one-year contract over there. So eventually my time was up, and unfortunately COVID also happened. So that brought me back to my home in the United States, where I, having learned from my time in Estonia and wanting to take some of both the lessons back as well as serve my own country, I ended up doing a program called Tech Congress, which is basically a nonprofit that staffs from it's aptly named. So it takes tech people and puts them in Congress. So I ended up working both on the House side and the U.S. Senate side, advising members of Congress on tech policy. And my focus ended up largely being on artificial intelligence. But I also, in my free time before that, a little bit, I had advised a startup trying to build a new digital free trade zone in small city in Nigeria. And so I was very interested in kind of good governance and how to use technology and governance to make people's lives better and to improve them. And as I started my time in government in the US, I realized, one, we were quite far behind from where I thought we were, maybe even dangerously so. And two, that I thought there were quite many lessons from Estonia that could be relevant to the United States. So what first kind of was me collating my thoughts and trying to take some lessons that I'd learned from Estonia ended up becoming a book, and that is Rebooting a Nation, and thank you for the kind introduction. But I want to start with something that's a little a little less incredible, because I think sometimes when we think about Estonia today, it's very much the fanciful. It has the beautiful old town and the gorgeous backdrop, and it focuses on the really nice parts of the story. But I think this is important both as a lesson for Estonia, but also for the rest of the world, and especially there's a lot of talk these days about U.S. competition with China, and so I like to remind myself, and I think Estonia's lessons is very important in doing this, that things can change dramatically in a very short amount of time. So in Estonia, in what they call the Bloody Autumn, there was basically a massive amount of crime and murders, and I forget exactly what the murder rate was, but I think it was on par with some of the headier days in Mexico. So it was quite dangerous for a brief period of time, and it also became a hub of metal theft. The image on the left is people queuing for bread in the late 1980s. Of course, this is still during the communist days, but I think it's emblematic of the idea that basically within a single generation, Estonia went from a place where things were dangerous in the downtown. There were criminals trying to take over, a lucrative metals trade and turn it into, basically a criminal hub. There was metal theft where people were, literally stealing cable and picking up the train track trellises to sell and melt down so they could have something to eat and to live by, to what in a generation later would become a digital nation, heralded in places like the New Yorker and basically every large mainstream publication you can think of. And I think it's really fascinating because if you look back a little bit further, before Estonia was occupied by Soviet Union, then Germany, then Soviet Union again during World War II, its GDP was on par, or I should say GDP per capita and quality of life was on par with neighboring Finland, which is shortly across the bay. And of course, you can kind of see the bottom of this line. You've got the early 1990s, and it's the GDP is quite bad, and the quality of life is, as you can imagine, very different from what it was in neighboring Finland. And then, but basically since re-independence, it was able to rebound. And now that GDP line, I'm still a startup guy at heart, even though I'm mostly doing government work these days. But this is the kind of line for an upwards growth trajectory that any startup would kill for. And I also love this image on the right because it has these little adorable delivery robots. And when I think about crime in Estonia, I was just there last May. I've been going back almost every year since I moved away. I think the only crime I see is maybe one of these things accidentally drops off the sidewalk and impedes traffic. So it's basically the only crime you see. Now, I don't want to paint Estonia as a totally idyllic place where nothing goes wrong. I mean, certainly there still is crime, there still is bad stuff, but I do want to emphasize the magnitude of the change that happened in a single generation. And now you're probably thinking, so why did this happen exactly? Oh, and then of course the fact that it's a startup hub is probably how many people, if they know about it either as an e-government or a startup hub, and some of the same founders of that little robot company were the same ones who created Skype. And so I think that if I look at how Estonia actually got to where it is today, there's kind of three major lessons that I want to talk about. So the first one is, a speech that Martin Lahr, who was kind of one of the earlier, I would say a founding father of modern Estonia, he was a prime minister at a time, is basically talking about the economic shock therapy that he put the country to: property reform, privatization, eliminating trade barriers, replacing the tax system with a simple flat tax, and of course rule of law. But that's a little bit on a different side. But I think that the economic shock therapy that he put the country to is interesting, not so much insofar as because of the economic policies itself, but because Lahr knew that it was going to be incredibly unpopular, but that he believed it was the right thing to do. And in retrospect, I think he probably made the right choice. We can quibble about, whether a flat tax versus a, graduated income tax is correct or optimal or whatnot. And indeed, there are now concerns about inequality, but undoubtedly for the time, it was, it was a rather good decision. But Lahr had this famous quip of, if the voters knew what was coming, they never would have elected us. And so, which just goes to show you that it's, this idea of bold leadership and political courage is something very important, and I think was foundational in the founding of modern Estonia. And those reforms help make Estonia an investment darling, and bring it in huge amounts of both foreign capital and foreign expertise, which then played into modernizing everything from factories to helping small businesses in the agricultural sector kind of grow, and giving Estonia the opportunity to compete at a more global scale and to increase quality of life. The second thing there, and many folks will have heard about the Tiger Leap campaign, and so this was basically the idea of connecting schools to the web and kind of closing the digital divide, so to say, which unfortunately, even in America, we're not there yet. But also training teachers so that they could, then teach students, and making sure that people were equipped to live and work in a more digital age. And again, this was something that I think is quite interesting, because this was something really pushed by President Ilves, who was another kind of founding father of modern Estonia. At the time, he was ambassador to the US, I believe, when he really saw this, and he had seen, kind of Netscape and the power of the modern internet. And he had also really identified the trend, or the idea that to compete in a globalized, diversified world, and for Estonia to have any chance at kind of making it out and leaping and crossing the chasm from this huge hole that the Soviets had left them in, especially relative to what they considered what is a peer nation, and their neighbor of Finland, which is often used as kind of this measuring stick. They would have to make huge leaps, and I think there's a reason it's called Tiger Leap. And so part of the reason I talk about this is because, one, it is quite impressive. They did manage to connect every school. A tremendous number of students were taught technical skills through this program, as well as teachers were able to access computers, and there was tertiary programs in the robotics space and other spaces that were quite interesting. But I think it's also emblematic of this long-term vision. And I mean, I think at a time, and I apologize, there are probably many global viewers on this call, but of course, I'm an American, so everything is an American centric view for me by default, and I apologize for that. But I think there's a lot of thinking in kind of the short term, and I really appreciate how long term some of the thoughts that Estonia had when they were kind of founding the modern society, and willing to think about things that wouldn't just help them in their political cycle, but would just be good foundationally for the country. And the last thing I want to talk about is kind of doing what's necessary even when it's unpopular. And this is a common theme throughout Estonian society. But I think it's funny because on the right you've got an example of an Estonian ID card, and I think when people think about Estonia, I think generally they think about either EIDs and kind of the e-government, or they think about the tech startups, right? And so, but when the EIDs were first coming out, there was a little bit of a joke that the only thing that they were good for was wiping the snow off the windshield, because they were well, frankly, there wasn't many services built to them. People didn't really see the point or the vision behind them, but the important thing that the kind of founding fathers did was they made them mandatory, and this was again an unpopular decision with that had probably negative political aspects for them. But instead of saying we're going to do halfway, or we're going to just split the difference here, and you can have ideas but not mandatory, they decided that the only way to kind of get the population bought in and get a big enough adoption rate that people would build off these is to make them mandatory. And I think this is really, really important because it is one of the defining characteristics, in my opinion, of why Estonia's digital government has taken off in a way, some other places in Europe, which also have digital identities and, kind of this backbone infrastructure. But when it's not mandatory, just to take an example, you're you run a bank. And you have a profit and loss statement. You have lots of things you can invest in. You can do lots of things. But so you might say, okay, we can invest more in cybersecurity, or we can create a new API so people can use their digital identity cards to log into our banks, which is more secure. But so only 2% of the population has it. It's not worth it. But if the equation is turned to 100%, or here 99% of Estonian residents have an ID card, that all of a sudden that equation changes for private businesses and for even other government agencies, right? So if you're the health ministry, all of a sudden you start thinking, okay, it makes a lot of sense to do electronic health records in the system because everyone can access it. And indeed, this is probably one of my favorite applications, although it's not talked about as much as kind of the digital signatures, which is the foundation. But the fact that everyone has a countrywide digital record is hugely impactful for Estonian society. And this is something that, as an American, is eternally frustrating for me, especially as an American who has moved many times and lived abroad many times, is that my records are smattered across healthcare sectors across the globe. And there was a great line from Dr. Eric Topol, who was asked about why cancer patients in the U.S. have to do kind of the same X-rays, the same things when they go to a new doctor, and why doesn't this information change? And he referenced Estonia in his answer and basically said, the Estonians already do this, and I do think you could save a tremendous amount of healthcare costs, which in the United States is billions and billions of dollars. And I think this is something that we can learn from Estonia about the importance of digital government. And we were talking a little bit before the call started of why I found Estonia so fascinating. And I think that Estonia has at least taught me, as a tech guy who started his career in Silicon Valley and was very much of the startups can do it all, and we can kind of do everything, of the importance of governance, and that when government done well can be hugely positively impactful for people. And of course, I had to add, there's a fun one. When I worked for the government, it was 99% of digital government services were enabled online. And the only things you couldn't do were get divorced and get married. Now you can do both, although I think it might still be a little awkward to do a digital divorce, but maybe it's less awkward than doing it in person. So so why does all this matter? And I love to use this example. I talked a little bit about the healthcare, but I'm sure someone, I don't remember where the quote comes from, but the only two things in life that are certain are death and taxes, right? So let's talk about taxes. The e-tax system in Estonia has 99% of declarations filed online, an average of about 3 minutes. So I can say, as an American, I filed my taxes there. It was a little bit more complicated for me. I mean, of course, I'm a foreign citizen. I had multiple factors of income. It took me under 5 minutes. I simply logged in with my digital identity card. I typed in my PIN. I typed in my verification number, and then I executed it. And because I had taken foreign language classes, which I didn't even realize at the time, I got a tax deduction on. It automatically calculated that for me, and I got a small rebate on my taxes because of that. And I mean, this is just an example. Now, of course, this cuts in multiple directions, right? You could say, okay, this is Big Brother and this is scary, or you could say, this is incredibly convenient and fantastic. And I would say there's some element of truth to both of those. I think that government is as good as our trust in it, and I think Estonia's government has proven time and time again it can be good stewards of the people's data, and of it can be trusted with that. But of course, if you have a government where there's lots of civil liberties violation, there's not enough trust, there's no government officials are kind of doing willy-nilly and looking things up, I can understand why people might be reticent to do that. But I will say, man, filing your taxes in 5 minutes compared to the American version of usually it takes me an entire weekend and costs me hundreds of dollars, not on the taxes itself, but of using a private system to actually file my taxes, is a very different experience. And it's something that costs Americans, I forget the exact statistics, but it's in the tens of billions of dollars annually, and it's in the thousands and thousands of hours of time. And because I think sometimes when we think about our interactions with government, we think about money, right? And most of our interactions with government don't cost us a lot of money, but they do cost us time. And so I would just say that, if you're thinking about things, it's also worth thinking about the time tax. If a government can bring your experience down from registering your small business, or from getting your driver's license permit, or any really any interaction, name the innumerable interactions with government you have, and can drive down the total amount of time that it takes you as a citizen, that leaves you more time to do the things you want, to be productive, to earn a living, et cetera, et cetera. And I could, there's something called time burden or time tax. And I think it is really important to calculate and think about these things. So I also bring this up because this article was from an op-ed journalist at the Wall Street Journal, Andy Kessler, that I really enjoy. And it was Estonia's lessons for Ukraine, but I actually think it's probably more relevant for the United States, for Germany, for Britain, because actually, quite candidly, I mean, Ukraine has well, lots of other difficulties going on right now. But when it comes to digital government, frankly, they're excelling any expectations. And I think I would consider them the leader in the world, if not the leader, certainly in the top three. I mean, they're even teaching the Estonians quite a few things now. So, but the reason I mentioned this is because state capacity enables small but efficient government. And former Prime Minister Kaja Kallas had noted in this. Using digital tools to decrease and diminish bureaucracy, that's how to create small government. And I do think that's something that is sometimes lost on folks, is that using technology is supposed to be about this idea of, automating systems, of making systems more efficient. And so when you're thinking about the use of technology in government, especially for, I'll speak broadly about the UK because other folks have mentioned this to me, is that I think if you're staring down a big budget deficit, for instance, or you're worried about government efficiency, certainly thinking about how to apply technology intelligently to those problems is a great way to potentially diminish bureaucracy while increasing the overall benefit that you can provide consumers. And the other reason I mention this is because some of the more libertarian folks in the audience, might be saying, "Oh, great, but we should have zero government," or that. And I love this quote by Jen Pahlka, she's the former deputy CTO. And if you're interested in kind of this topic space, she wrote a fantastic book, Recoding America. It is very America centric, but it's still a great book. And her quote is, "We can't do without government, but we do need it to be more effective." And I totally think that's true. And this is something that I personally have, very much come around in my life journey on. And it's part of the reason why I spend so much time in government. But one thing I do want to warn people about is because Estonia built its systems mostly in the early 1990s, right? Most of it was built in a world where people were accessing the internet on a desktop, either at home or at school or at work. These were big honking machines. The age of the iPhone was nowhere near coming. So most of Estonia's architecture was kind of built for this, right? And so I think many people, and this was my experience when I was working for the Estonian government, and I would do, foreign delegations would come in, and especially American ones, because I was the American that's, okay, you go talk to them, and talk to them about Estonia's story. And a lot of them said, okay, so we can just copy Estonia, we can take what they did and we just bring it over here. And I would warn folks that, I don't think it's that simple. I would look at what technology stack enables at the time. So we mentioned Ukraine a few minutes ago, and I think that's a fantastic lesson in applying the ideal technology of the time, because Ukraine's modernization happened a few years after Estonia. I should say more than a few years, a decade plus after most of Estonia's, and in fact was aided by the e-governance academy and many Estonian folks. But what they did is they identified that that while Estonia had focused on the desktop, Ukraine had moved on, and many people were accessing basically anything in their lives on their mobile devices. And I will date myself, because for me, doing something like filing my taxes or even purchasing an expensive plane ticket is that's, I'm old school. That's a desktop activity for me. I want to have multiple tabs open and compare and whatever. But for many younger folks, or if you kind of grew up with only a smartphone, it's natural for you to just use that. And Ukraine has used DIA to great effect to kind of put the state in the smartphone. And I would argue that I don't want to argue definitively that AI will be kind of the next paradigm change, but I think many people believe that, and it is, worth kind of considering as you are thinking about, changing government, or building the kind of the next generation of government services for your country or society, or even just advocating for things, to just think about what technology actually enables, right? So just don't carbon copy Estonia because it did well, 30 years ago, and it's still doing very well, but think about what technology and what society fundamentally enables for your situation now. And I do love these things because there is a next big leap. We talked about the Tiger Leap campaign, and Estonia is definitely, significantly doubling down on AI. And one of the things that I love about Estonia is that their willingness to experiment with new technologies and try new things, as well as trusting their people and rolling things out and letting them play with them and experiment themselves. So on the top left here, we have Estonia and OpenAI. I think it says partner to bring ChatGPT to schools. And I think this is emblematic of a time where much of the debate in many places are kids are using this for cheating. What will happen to education? So, okay, yes, those are totally valid concerns, but we should, we can't put technology back in the box. So what do we do to basically equip our people to be ready for the society of the future, so they can, kind of live in this next iteration of the world or next generation of technology and succeed, right? And I think that's an excellent frame to look at how to run a society. Future-proofing Estonia. So I have to mention kind of the defense tech side of the world, as well as the complicated neighborhood that Estonia finds itself in. I think when you think about Estonia, you have to think about the complicated geography of the country, and the fact that it has a long history of repeated occupations. I mean, whether from many neighbors, but of course the Russian and Soviet Union. And Estonia is a country that this is very deep inside the psyche of basically everyone, and affects everything that you do. And so part of the reason I put e-residency on here, which is the program that I used to work for, is because even this program, which is ostensibly about, it was a program built to give third country nationals access to Estonia's digital infrastructure. And at first, it didn't even have a plan for how people were going to use this at first. It was just kind of this cool idea that people thought would be interesting, and then picked up on it. And eventually it became a way for people to build location independent businesses. So we have tons of folks from, Turkey or India or Ukraine, or even Western Europe, frankly, where the bureaucracy is a bit overwhelming, that choose to, operate their business in Estonia remotely. But a big part of the idea behind the program was that if Estonia could maximize its number of friends and links around the world, that would make it more resilient in case of people threatened it. Then maybe the folks from Turkey or India who ran their business, or Germany or the United States or wherever, would raise a stink in their local constituencies and say, we can't stand for this. We know Estonia. We know it's important. And also, frankly, it wanted to portray itself, and I think this is the rightful portrayal. But I think sometimes I'll speak for Americans, is that sometimes we lump much of Eastern Europe into this kind of post-Soviet bucket, instead of the more nuanced geography and the complexities of a region. And it wanted to make sure it stood out as a vibrant democracy, that was tech forward, and actually contributed significant amounts to Western society, and had deep links with not just Silicon Valley, but the rest of the world. And so I say that to mention that if I look at how Estonia kind of approaches things, most have maybe not just the fundamental reason on top, but also a kind of a secondary or tertiary reason of wanting to help secure the country. On the left is Frankenberg Technologies. So they've got a little anti-drone missile, and I apologize, I don't know exactly the nuances. I think, well, that's intentional on their part. It isn't super public yet, but they're deeply investing into defense tech, and I think many of the folks who have links to Eastern Europe or Ukraine can sympathize with this. And even in the United States, there's been a bit of a defense tech renaissance, in the sense that the world is a dangerous and complex place, and I think that when I look at how Estonia has approached this, it's also very interesting. They have created a venture fund. Well, it's more like a limited partnership fund where they invest in other domestic VC firms to help kind of build up the defense tech ecosystem. They also invested in the NATO Innovation Fund, and now are home to one of the NATO Diana Accelerator programs for this. And of course, they're investing huge amounts in just local purchases. Now, huge amounts is relative. As part of their GDP, I think they're planning to get up to 5% very quickly, but in absolute terms, I know it's not huge amounts, but in relative terms, it's quite important. But they also constantly are trying to make sure that there are not roadblocks in the way of entrepreneurs, especially in critical industries. So down at the bottom is probably my favorite tagline of a government agency I've ever seen, is Accelerate Estonia, making illegal things legal. And this is basically kind of a reverse startup accelerator program for those who are familiar, where they take entrepreneurs with ideas and then kind of match make them with government agencies and help them to clear out the roadblocks that these entrepreneurs are facing. So maybe you have a novel transportation idea, let's say autonomous vehicles, right? So they might, take an autonomous vehicle company. Okay, you want to have autonomous vehicles in the country. Tell us what regulations are kind of hampering you and holding you back. And they kind of work hand in glove with the private sector, again, especially in kind of critical sectors, to make sure that these roadblocks don't exist. And I think this is an excellent way to kind of ensure the innovation ecosystem in a country can continue, but also is just absolutely necessary in a country where innovation is your primary export and national message. So the last thing I want to leave folks on is Kaya Kallas spoke right before she left for higher office within the EU about the importance of mindset over matter and what was behind Estonia's success. And I do want to kind of go back a little bit and reference this because in the last examples, most of the things I talked about don't take a ton of money. I mean, it doesn't take a ton of money for the public sector to really work with leaders in the private sector, trustworthy, of course, and you can't bias things, but going out and proactively trying to understand what is holding back innovation, what can we change, what can we make easier, how can we take public dollars and invest them in a way that's really efficient, that will maximize return? How can we have long-term plans that will help ensure the future of our country? And I think that is all emblematic of this kind of mindset of wanting to build a country that will last for, maybe not eternity, but certainly that will last for decades, and as well as one, frankly, that is has repeated occupations and wants to make sure that they are never occupied again, and also has a bit of a let's say friendly competition with its neighbors, both in the north and the south, where I think it has an element of Estonia, when I worked there, very much was on a public push to be portrayed as Nordic, because they kind of felt that they should be in the Nordic panoply of nations, and they were say we're more akin to Finland than we are to the other Baltics. It's a quirk of history that we were kind of lumped in here, and I think there is this very much, as I mentioned, there's Estonia has long used Finland as a measuring stick, and so after the Soviet Union, when they saw just how disparate the outcomes were between the two nations, of feeling like they had to really take bold steps to try and cross this chasm, that there was this kind of element that permeated the mindset of not just the politicians, but also the population, which kind of enabled them to deliver on these lofty promises and go along with, frankly, some of these schemes that were somewhat unpopular and a little bit crazy at the time, right? I mean, if you're in the early 90s and you're a country that is dealing with maybe not exactly food shortages, but the quality of life is not so high, and some educated foreign minister is coming to you and saying, what we should do with our limited budget is we should connect every school in the country, and we should buy loads of computers and teach our kids how to program. I mean, that is a little bit of a crazy idea when the teachers unions might say like, "Hey, our pensions were decimated. We need funding for basic pension matters." And I think being willing to take these bold leaps, this long term thinking, and doing what was unpopular but at the time was critical for success is emblematic of why Estonia has this mindset that has made it so successful. So with that, thank you very much for having me. I hope I'm roughly on time and looking forward to chatting about your questions.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was great. I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions. I can see there are quite a few there already. But let me ask the first one. So, if there was one cool thing that you could transplant from Estonia to the US, what would that be?
I think it would be the tax system. I think we were. It feels like and I should do the caveat. I'm speaking in my personal capacity, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the tax system, this idea of especially making it easy for folks to file their taxes in a way that's simple. And I think the thing that bugs me the most about this is the government has most of the information to do this, right? I mean, if you work for a company, and of course, there's complexities for individual contractors and for folks with tons of money and different things. But the vast majority of us have one job and kind of relatively simple income streams in tax scenarios. And the government has this information. They should either pre-populate your forms or do more to make it easier to file your taxes, because it's also like we're paying you, like I'm trying to give you money. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing. But as I said, one of my favorite is the health is the digital health files, just because I'm also a big fan of this idea of like, if we have more healthcare information, that would allow us to do more research into cool medicines and create new treatments and whatever. And I think I personally am one of those people who would love to like donate my my genetic information to so people can do more investigations in this sort of thing. So I think the medical records would also be quite neat.
Can you maybe quickly remind us, our viewers, how does this e-tax system work in Estonia? Like, for instance, how does it differ from what we have here in the UK? You also have like e-tax declaration and so on. But what's there that's cutting edge in Estonia?
Yeah. So I'm not so familiar with the UK. I haven't had the privilege of filing taxes there just yet, but I can speak to Germany and the US, which were somewhat similar. In Estonia, all it is literally the government gets, they're having all your information from your work. All the information comes to the government agency, and then on tax day or whatever day the declarations are initially sent out to folks. All it does is it kind of renders a pop-up for you in your e-government profile or your system, and sends you a message saying this is ready. You put in your digital identity card, it pops up, it's entirely pre-filled, so it's just done. It's of course there are some people with like complexity. Maybe you own a foreign company, maybe you have some foreign assets that are more complicated that aren't in their system. But for the vast majority of people, something like 90+%, it's just done, and it's all pre-filled. You just check it, make sure it's okay, and then you click accept, and it's done. And that's literally it. And so it just the government basically does the work up front for you, as compared to the US, where usually what I get is oh gosh, is it W2W, whatever. You get a form in the mail, and usually your company will email it to you as well, saying, here's this form, you got to kind of fill it out. And there's some government, I think for some low income folks, there's government options to do a state run thing, but you have both federal and state taxes, so you kind of have two different tax systems. So usually you'll get this paper form, or you'll get an email version of the paper form, and then you have to go to a private software company and go and pay them to use their software and kind of fill out the information that was in this form. And some of them now have something where you can take a photo of it or upload it to make it a little bit easier, but it's basically transplanting this information. And then you check everything, you fill in a bunch more boxes. Usually, I mean, like I said, mine is not so complex. It usually takes me a full weekend, just because you have to double check things, you have to do it. And so then I then pay this private company to file my taxes for me. I think it cost me $150 last year, something like this. and then I pay my taxes, right? And so basically, it's the Estonian system is different in that it takes dramatically less time, and they have a free alternative that actually is very good. And I would say, yeah, they have a free alternative that is a better experience than the one you would get in other countries. I mean, in Germany, of course, I didn't speak German, so I didn't even try. And you just hire a Steuerberater and an accountant to do it for you for a few hundred to a few $1,000s, right?
That's fascinating. Let me ask you another one, which is kind of connected. Are there things in your mind that do not scale well when increasing the country size? When, we think about what things, for instance, the US could import, things that only work in Estonia because it's a minuscule country, essentially, and that wouldn't work in a bigger country.
I'd say so. On the technology side, not exactly, because I think that's one of the benefits of technology, and part of the reason why the e-residency program exists is because they were like, well, we have digital identity for everyone. I mean, from a technology standpoint, you can create a robust architecture that scales to millions, and you just add more servers, right? This is the idea of behind venture capital, is that adding one more user to a Facebook or to a Twitter costs nothing relative to the initial investment, and that's why you get venture scale returns. However, where I think the complexities lie in why these things sometimes are much more difficult is partially because of what the example we just talked about is because Estonia is such a tiny market. Sometimes it is not worth bothering in for companies to try and do something. And this is my best guess. I'm not 100% positive about this. Is that for instance, it is a multi-billion-dollar business to do the tax system in the US, right? Or to do to have a private tax provider in the US. It is a multi-billion-dollar system to do the private electronic health records in the US. I'm not sure how big the Estonian market would be if it was run by the private sector, but I can imagine that it would not be quite as big as that. And also it's a relatively small market, so there might just have been less let's say economic dynamism in the space where the government might have felt less constrained by private actors who wanted to compete in that market and more able to basically contract, because many of these services the government didn't literally build them themselves. The private sector did build them, but they build them as a service instead of a market that they were competing in. And so I do think that is one of the major factors of if you had a bigger market that might lead companies to kind of scream like, hey, government shouldn't be doing this, let us do it because this is a big enough market that we want to play
in. Thank you. Let's go to our audience questions now. Let me see what we have got here. So Carl Isherwood is asking, thank you for reference to the UK. Are the lessons learned from Estonia applicable to the UK, giving the difference in terms of size? And then we can group this with another question, which says, what lessons do you think that the EU countries can learn from Estonia? So basically, UK and the EU. Do you see anything that's like really easy to copy there, or because you've been talking about the US mostly, but these guys are asking about the EU and the UK, I guess.
Yeah. So I think I would go to the lesson of the making the digital identity mandatory. This is something that I think is unpopular for, I lived in, like I said, I lived in Germany only briefly. So I know a tiny bit about German culture. And my understanding is that there is more hesitancy or more concern around things like privacy than in Estonia, or at least in a different way, right? I personally think Estonia's methods are quite privacy preserving in an odd way. Now, I can unpack that later if you like as to why I think Estonia is actually more privacy preserving than most other countries. But I can understand on kind of the face of it why people would think, digital identity feels big brothery, and what about my privacy? What if the government has all this information? And so that being said, I think that this splitting the difference where you're trying to run both an old archaic, the old school paper system, the old way of doing government, and invest in new services, like it ends up in a situation where you're trying to do you do both worlds mediocre or poorly instead of doing one world really well. And I think, the UK, my impression is that at least some years ago, there was a concerted effort and some really great stuff with the government digital service and kind of unifying the way websites looked and doing a lot of investment there. I'm not as familiar lately. I haven't kept up with it, unfortunately, but I think the UK did a lot of incredible work there. But I look at, the amount of vitriol that's coming about talking about the digital identity program that was just floated, and I think part of that is framing and timing and these sorts of things. I don't know enough about domestic politics to understand exactly what the problem is here, but I will say I think that leaders doing things that are unpopular but are long term will matter the most is critical. So if you want a practical example, I think something like digital identity or investing or mandating certain solutions, or saying like, okay guys, we're going to every government employee now has to do their job digitally instead of using paper forms. I don't know, but like we're really kind of moving to the next stage and saying, okay, we're going to move to the next era. I'm sorry, but we're done with the 1800s papers and this sort of thing.
Thank you. It would be interesting to see how the UK does it, because it's a very slow-moving country, and I think Estonians have an advantage here because it's their size and their sort of courage, if you will. Okay, let's.
And I did.
Yeah.
I would just make a comment that I do think there is a really interesting phenomenon where successful countries have a difficult time changing, and of course they do, because if I'm America, like quality of life is quite good. Like, yeah, the government is sometimes poor and whatever, the services are a bit annoying, but like overall things are quite good in America, and I would say ditto with Britain and Germany, and I think that they have enough money that they can literally paper over their problems in government and in the private sector sometimes. And these things are sometimes masked because you can use enough money or to get over things where if you're German and you make good amounts of money, you can pay this Steuerberater to do your taxes for you. And yeah, it's annoying and costs some money, but you can afford it. And the government can afford to be on paper-based systems because overall it's quite a wealthy country. Whereas if you're Estonia in the early 90s, you literally cannot afford it. Your choices are not providing critical resources for your population, or to digitize and create more modern systems. So I do think there's this element of almost it's kind of the opposite of a resource curse. It's to a success curse, if you will, where it's hard to change once you've been successful.
Very interesting. Let's go to Ukraine now. There is a whole bunch of questions about Ukraine. So Nia van der Velden is asking, would you be able to provide us with a bit more about Estonians' lessons for Ukraine? Would you be able to talk about DIIA or Ukraine's e-government app? Do you think that it would be feasible for Ukrainians to vote on DIIA similar to the way Estonians vote? Or is there too much of a risk about cybersecurity and disinformation campaigns?
Yeah. So a couple initial comments. One initial comment is that, I think that Ukraine, I think, is a fantastic case study. And I don't think it's appropriate for me, but I do hope somebody writes the book on Ukraine's e-government and modernization, and that is more familiar with the country. But from my research into Estonia, because as you can imagine, there's deep links between the two countries, having both been occupied, and of course the Estonians are quite strongly supporting Ukraine ever since the invasion. In the early days of Ukraine's modernization programs, Estonia provided a bunch of capacity for helping build Prozoro, for instance, and the e-governance academy kind of helped supply the early lessons and capacity in the first iterations and the first couple services that the Ukrainians were building. I'm sorry, Prozoro is the public procurement system, which I think the former CTO or former digital minister of France called kind of the global standard or the gold standard. So it's quite a good system. That being said, I think Ukraine, partly because they started a little bit later and were willing to invest in, they went mobile first rather than desktop first, like the Estonians did, and they don't kind of have this legacy infrastructure that the Estonians do now, and partly because well, one, it was a strategic priority for President Zelensky, kind of the state in the smartphone, and as part of the drive to eliminate corruption, and of course because of the war, it's just necessary. They are doing phenomenally well. As I mentioned, I would rank them in either the top or the top one or two, the top couple of in terms of e-government and kind of innovation in this space. The amount of services that are now enabled with DIA or through kind of the defense side that allow them to use the mobile applications to do a huge host of services is critical. On the voting one, generally, I'm not sure for everybody. I think Estonia's voting, I think, is quite interesting in the sense that it actually didn't dramatically change voting patterns or the number of people who voted. And my naive take initially was I would have thought that it would dramatically increase youth votes because young people you don't want to queue forever, and young are usually somewhat more disaffected or whatever, right? It didn't. Estonia has like pretty normal rates of youth voting compared to the rest of the EU. It did, on the margins, certainly it helped, but what I think it helped more people, and this is maybe where it's more relevant to Ukraine, is especially for members of the diaspora, instead of having to I forget if you have to either physically go to an embassy or mail your ballot to an embassy, and then the embassy sends it back to your country. If you this is kind of the normal way to vote. But now Estonia, of course, you can anywhere you have your digital identity card and an internet connection, you can just vote from your computer. And given the number of folks in the diaspora in Ukraine now who are still quite engaged in the society and politics, I could see this being quite helpful for people who are not local. Of course, the issues with corruption and cybersecurity and disinformation and all these things. I don't know if this is. I think this is. It's sometimes funny when the government issues come up, because sometimes these issues are not so much a technology issue and are more a society governance, sociology issue. And I would definitely put that more in that bucket. I would guess that you could create a robust enough system to get around this, but now would people trust it enough in the current environment? I don't know.
So on this voting thing, the rest of Europe are not doing this, right? Estonia is probably one of the like, it's either just one or I don't know. Are there any others in the EU who does e-voting? Probably not.
Maybe for I was certainly not on the national level. I don't believe.
Yes.
I think some population might allow them for some edge cases, military deployed abroad, or these sorts of things. But I don't think on a national level.
So then
this is the same for
So then there must be a reason. So why they're not doing this. So either the rest are incompetent and slow, or or it works in Estonia only because for its particular features, like small size. I remember when the Estonians just started rolling this out, this e-voting thing in 2000s. I talked to a few IT people in the other Baltic states, and they were like, "Forget it. It's a security nightmare. Nothing is going to work, and this is just it's impossible." And now the Estonians are doing it, but the rest are still not doing it. So I wonder, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I've definitely seen when I was doing the research on this, many people also think it's crazy and not possible. When even though Estonia has done it with a history of having done it successfully with no cyber incidents, at least reported, I think again it's a matter of a combination of necessity, interest, will. I mean, all these factors that if I'm Germany, just to pick on the Germans, because at least I'll pick on the Germans here because they're fantastic and but still slow to pick up sometimes on the more digital things is I think they might just not feel the necessity of doing something like that, right? I mean, the paper-based system works pretty well. There are some small complaints, but how many people are really queuing up and shouting no, in the street saying, "This is my number one priority. I want to be able to vote online." I mean, I don't think this is in most people's top 10 priorities, right? Whereas for Estonia, they were kind of had this big vision of creating a digital society, and this is one of the components as part of this larger vision. So I think it's more a matter of will, and indeed, this is probably one of the most complex cases where less complex in the technical sense, but in the trust sense of your party loses, the first election after this thing gets implemented, your party loses, even if there wasn't necessarily any issue with this. Maybe you complain and you say like, but it was a new system, or maybe there was a cybersecurity point. It's easy to introduce more. Any new system allows for the introduction of more concerns or complaints, and I think that's you actually see this in Estonia, where some of the I think it's fair to say from the research, usually the parties that have more elderly or rural voters are more likely to criticize e-voting because their voters don't use it. So they're happy to say it's not workable, it's not whatever, because it's young people in the capital who are using e-voting, and so they're happy to sow distrust and say that we should get rid of it because their voters don't use it. So they're happy to do something that is annoying for the other party, right? So I think it's more a matter of political will and just will in general than it is of anything else.
Another one on Ukraine. This is an interesting one. Do you think that the Ukraine's digital transformation throughout the war will help them become members of the EU faster, given the Draghi report that discusses the importance of the EU becoming more resilient? I don't know if you can answer that, but
yeah, without any insider information on that, like I certainly I don't know, but I hope so, in the sense that like I think it would be. I think we should certainly be looking, and I will speak for my sense as an American as well as living in Europe. I mean, anywhere in the West that cares about resilience and this stuff, like we have had a serious problem with being able to innovate in the real world and often in the digital world. And I think Ukraine has showed a magnificent ability to do both. It's unfortunate. I mean, more than unfortunate circumstances in which they have to do it, but their ability to create new drones, new armaments, and to innovate on DIA and these things. I mean, they are going to have one of the most robust defense industrial bases, if they don't already, as well as one of the most well-trained and battle-hardened militaries in the entire world. And I think that this plus their digital success. And I would say, it's not just the e-government side. I mean, Estonia has always been a hub for, kind of IT outsourcing. They had outstanding developers for a long time. And it was kind of one of those places where lots of companies went and set up, secondary facilities or, would outsource because their engineers were great and they were low cost. And it was kind of the lowest hanging fruit on the way to digital industrialization, let's say, in the same way, countries will start with, light manufacturing, then work their way up to more complicated stuff. And I think that Ukraine is skipping up this ladder very quickly, in part because of necessity, but in part because their talent base is incredible. So I think it would be a huge loss to the West not to acknowledge these pros.
Thank you. What else do we have here? Okay, this one is about public trust. Kaspar Schulze is asking, with reference to the issue of public trust, how are Estonian citizens kept abreast of how their digital data is used by government? Are agencies, departments required to notify citizens when they access their data? If so, how does this functionally work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the best way to, one, yes, there is both. I'd say it's a combination of legislation and norms. So there's a couple things like the once only rule, where basically if you give your information once to the government, they shouldn't ask for it again. So they're kind of making sure that this stuff is unified, but also there's pretty strong privacy protections. One example of this is that there was a former police officer who looked up his, I think, bride-to-be or somebody's personal data, which of course is not allowed. And it is, he was ended up, I'm not sure if he ended up in jail for a super long time, but certainly it was a massive court case and he got in quite a lot of trouble for it. So there have been a couple of instances of people abusing their authority to try and look at government data. But let me show you, I had mentioned during the talk that I actually think that the Estonian way is more privacy preserving. So let me just give you an example. So, or rather a comparison. So in the US, the government has let's take my tax records. So, the IRS somewhere in some building has my tax records probably in a file. Maybe they have some physical ones, maybe they have some digital ones. As a citizen, I have no way of knowing who has looked at my information. I have no way of knowing actually what information they have on me. It's kind of a blank box. I mean, maybe no one has done anything. Maybe someone has used it. I don't know. I just have no context on that. I have no way of finding out. In Estonia, I have my digital profile that has it basically has all the information that that the government has collected on me or has access to. And so, to give you an example of like the health records, for instance, this is one where you kind of go more back and forth. It'll have like a log next to it. So you go to your health records, and then you can see who has accessed it. And so, for example, maybe you have a doctor's appointment the next day. It would not be unusual that your doctor has accessed your health records, right? And so, the way they've built the technology is such that you have the traceability to see who has done what with your records. And so, if someone looks at that, or say you get pulled over on a you're driving and you get pulled over, the police might pull up your driving record attached to your digital identity, right? Or whatever record to make sure that you actually have a driver's license, you have insurance, you're not a criminal, et cetera, right? So, but that'll be logged, and you can kind of audit that, and you also are allowed to, as a citizen, basically demand the government tell you if there's a use that you don't understand or don't agree with, the rationale for that. So you can tell them, I want you to explain why this happened, and they're mandated to actually give you a response. So in a way, it's like, and this is why I said during the talk that this only works in a society with strong rule of law, strong democracy, and trust. Because indeed, you do have to trust that like this log makes sense. Eventually, you have to trust something. You have to trust that the log makes sense, or that the government isn't making fake reasons for why they do this, et cetera. But you do have pretty strong controls as an individual to mandate that the government give you information on how your information was used, who accessed it, and they have strong controls internally, right? So like I think the only people who have like really robust and can kind of go in without any authorizations are like probably like the state security services, like the equivalent of like the FBI, right? But everyone else has pretty strict controls. So if your doctor tried to access your well, I don't think they even literally could, like from the system, like your driver's record, they just wouldn't get access to that. It doesn't make sense for them. But if your doctor accesses your health record, they're authorized to do that. So the way the system and like digital infrastructure is set up, plus the backbone of the legislation and frankly just norms, just makes it very privacy preserving. But again, that only works in a democratic society with strong rule of law.
So, for instance, in case of voting, is this system really bulletproof, or have there been any cases of abuse, like hacking or someone adding 1 million votes just by logging into someone's computer?
Probably not. Probably not 1 million. That'd be a little suspicious. But look, I would say like I guess as a I've been in tech a long time. There's a joke in tech that there's two types of people: those who have been hacked and those who know that they've been hacked, right? And so, like, I would be shocked if eventually there isn't some problem with the voting system, or with any IT system, or frankly with any system at all at scale, right? Like, you look at paper voting. I think it's relevant to look at the counterfactual of like the incidents in how many incidents of fraud whatever in paper voting and like traditional methods versus these one. And so far my understanding is that there have been no known or reported incidences of issues or cyber issues on the e-voting side. So far no, but I would be skeptical that lasts forever. Like eventually there will be some exploit, someone will make a mistake, someone will do something, right? But that would happen with paper-based systems too.
Thank you, Joel. Let's look at audience questions again. So someone is asking, do you have any recommendations for books and or articles that we should read if we are interested in learning more about Ukraine's DIIA and their partnership with Estonia in order to scale up their digital transformation?
On that specifically, so let me share a link to. I created a reading list. It's not exactly on Ukraine, but it does have a lot of information on issues around this. No, I think this is something I think somebody should write a book on or should do some serious studying on. I think it's an emerging area. Looking at well, I think looking at Ukraine's scale up and how they were able to do that, I think would be a fascinating book or case study. So I hope somebody works on that.
Thank you. There is a question about the Netherlands. I don't know how familiar are you with the Dutch system, but Nia is asking, what are some of the differences between the Estonian government's approach to e-government services versus the Netherlands? In the Netherlands, she says, we're unable to vote online, but other than that, it seems like the services are similar. Beyond Estonia and the Netherlands, are there other EU countries with digital IDs, for instance?
Yeah. So I'm unfortunately I'm not super familiar with the Netherlands, but indeed I have heard that the Netherlands and I think it's Denmark also have quite robust e-government systems. So not so surprising. I think when I think about the differences, I think again this is partially the mentality in the sense of like Estonia has an actual government agencies that's practically looking and trying to proactively work with private sector individuals to find regulations that are holding them back from innovating. It's actively working to support the venture capital ecosystem and the tech ecosystem. It actively tries to kind of bring in people from the private sectors on tours of duty. So I think that's how I would kind of differentiate over time. But other countries with digital IDs, I'm pretty sure the Finns have one. Actually, I think quite many countries have some digital ID, but the rates of adoption are usually quite low because, indeed, as I mentioned before, if you're a country and 6% of your people have digital identities, it's not really worth it for a government agency or let alone a private business to invest in building infrastructure or things around that. So maybe some governments will do it regardless and have enough money to do it. But in Estonia, just to give an example, like if you go to the grocery store, they all have loyalty programs where you can use your digital identity card. So rather than carrying around, I have a grocery store in my neighborhood, I carry around a little physical, plastic card that I scan at the checkout when I go. Instead, I would just bring my equivalent of my driver's license, and that would function as my digital identity, as my card. So, like, there's all these and it's funny because it feels like a very small example, but take 100 or 1,000 of these little cuts and little time taxes and little annoyances in your day, and eventually they add up to something meaningful.
Thank you. Let me reverse my previous question. So, what are the things in tech that Estonia cannot do due to its minuscule size?
Yeah, I think if I look at the current so right now, when most of my time is spent in AI right now, and if I look at the AI conversation, much of it is dominated by scale. I mean, these big companies are AI labs are investing billions and talking about trillions of dollars in new data centers and new infrastructure in this. And I think I have a hard time believing a country like Estonia could compete at that level just from getting enough capital to play at that game. I think that would be very, very difficult. That being said, I think there were some lessons from the early days in Estonia where sometimes their engineers were even better than foreign engineers because they were compute constrained even in the early days. They had what was it, 86-bit? I forget exactly, but like they had much worse computing facilities, and like so they would have to like write much more elegant code than other people in order to like run them on their computers, which had much less memory, which meant that when they ended up building programs, they were more robust. So like think about Skype, right? Like Skype was unique because it used a peer-to-peer service because buying a centralized service was out of the question for these guys, and like so they kind of created a new way to access like the global internet. And so I think like necessity is the mother of invention. So I think like if you think about AI in the current AI race, if you're thinking in the current compute scaling paradigm where you need, like gigawatts of energy and billions of dollars in investment in cutting edge graphics chips and GPUs, I think Estonia would have a very hard time competing in that paradigm. Now, if you're thinking of the paradigm of like, okay, but open source AI is like 80 to 90% is good, and it's only 6 months behind these guys, and we can be the fast followers who adopt AI for our defense tech ecosystem or our startup ecosystem and like leverage that the best. Maybe that's the right. So yeah, I think they would have difficulty in the kind of current paradigm, but these things are very fuzzy.
Can I ask how has the war in Ukraine affected Estonia's tech sector in terms of, I don't know, capital flight and things like that? Or perhaps did it create new opportunities like, for instance, drones need AI, right, to track targets and so on?
Yeah, I think the answer is both. So there was a great article. I think it was one of the co-founders of Bolt who dubbed it Putin's tax. So Estonia's had a bit more difficult time recruiting foreign talent, as well as getting foreign investment. Which, of course, I mean, if you constantly it's in the news, maybe you're from the U.S., maybe you're from I don't know France or something, and you're saying, well, this country, it sounds idyllic, but like, do I really want to be an engineer that, it could be invaded any day? Like, of course, it makes people hesitate, right? And so I think it certainly has caused some issues. And for if you were going to build a big factory that needs 20 years to produce the returns you expect, you're going to have some hesitation there, right? However, the war has, as you alluded to, I mean, on drones and on every other sense, I think it has created an opportunity and a bit of a rush to do this. And I think there is I think it was Sten Tomkivi who told me, who's now a venture, he now runs a venture firm in Estonia, but he was an early Skype guy and kind of early in many tech things in Estonia, that there's an irrational patriotism in Estonia. And I think the war in Ukraine has really been a catalyst for saying like, okay, this is basically at our borders. Ukraine is fighting the fight for us. We need to be ready and provide equipment and do all these things. And I went to this conference Latitude that happens every year, and I've been many years now, and this was the first year that usually it has consumer health, like it has different veins of types of startups. This one was almost wholly dominated by defense tech companies. So I think it is both in the amount of capital, but also the amount of interest in what people are working on. I think the war has created a dramatic shift in where the talent is going and what people are willing to do. So there is money. People are building there. I don't want to say like the startup scene hasn't been dramatically affected, but certainly there have been differing effects.
Is there any American capital in Estonian tech sector, as far as you know?
Oh, I'm sure. So at least since the Skype days, there's been pretty strong links between Estonia and Silicon Valley, in part because Estonia's capital markets were relatively small. So Skype raised money in their early rounds from Tim Draper, who's kind of a well-known Silicon Valley investor from back in the day, as well as I forget who else, but some other Silicon Valley folks, and that kind of gave Estonia tech community a reputation of like these crazy Estonian guys who are building this global brand and like a quite impressive company, and gave other Estonian entrepreneurs a brand and a leg up because you can imagine like before this, I mean, if you're an American, like the big countries, but like maybe you don't know Estonia unless you're kind of a student of Europe or of that geography. And so you can imagine some guy emails you out of the blue saying, "Hey, I'm running a startup in Estonia, this country you've never heard of, and you should send me a check for $1 million." Like you might be a little skeptical, right? But now you're like, oh, I know the Skype guys. They made gobs of money. They had a great company. So now you're just like a little more credulous when other Estonian entrepreneurs come to town. And so Sten Tomkivi, who I just mentioned, was actually an entrepreneur in residence at Andreessen Horowitz, one of the major venture capital firms, a little while ago. I think why I want to say, oh shoot, I don't want to make a mistake on the company, but I know one of the major verification companies, I think Verif, went through Y Combinator and raised a bunch of money from Silicon Valley VCs as well. So yeah, indeed, there are quite strong links, especially between Estonia and Silicon Valley. I don't know about other capital markets in other parts, but from Silicon Valley to Estonia, yes.
Our time is nearing the end, but let me ask you the final question that I'm always asking my students. So, what are the three most important findings of your book? Because they say, if you cannot summarize it in three things, then you you really don't know your thing. So there's a challenge for you.
But now if I tell you, they won't buy it.
Well, that would be a nice teaser, wouldn't it? I mean,
no. So the three most important lessons I think are well, one, I would say, the mindset is hugely important, and this was actually I have to admit a little bit frustrating for me because I didn't, when I wanted to, I spent a lot of time. I think there's 750, 800 citations in the book. I really wanted it to be very robust and fact driven and like very specific. And its mindset is this kind of fluffy thing along with culture and idea. But the importance of mindset in a country is hugely important. So I would say emphasizing the importance of mindset, the importance of long-term strategy and thinking, not just about the next 4 years or whatever the political cycle or whatever cycle folks are in, but really long-term thinking and strategy for a country. And I would just look at again, and this will play into the last one, how dramatically things can change in a few years, in a few decades, with sustained investment, sustained interest, and technological progress. And so that's kind of the last thing I would mention is don't build for the technology of yesterday or even today. Look at what's coming in the near future or just emerging when you're actually going to build things. Because again, I think there's a lot of things to say. Okay, maybe today China is a more apt example of people are saying, okay, well, China did this and they managed to become the industrial leader of the world, so we should copy China doing X. It's like, okay, maybe, but like, maybe that only worked because the circumstances such in the 1990s and 2000s made it so like those investments worked. What should we be doing today that will benefit for the next 20 or 30 years to put us on the right track for the future? So I guess that's something I would both remind people and warn people of. It's easy to say, okay, X worked here, we'll do X here as well. And I think X, doing something somewhere else is sometimes useful, but we should also look at the technology. And that's why I brought up AI on one of the last slides. It's, I'm not sure if that's like, I shouldn't say it because I do a lot of work in AI. So this is kind of my job. But and I am bullish on AI, but I don't want to say like wholeheartedly, this is the only thing that's going to matter in the future. But I think if you're going to build government services, going to plan for, how you're going to make life better for your constituents or citizens, I think you have to consider how AI might create opportunities for that, even if it's as simple as like, rather than having a static chatbot or like a bunch of junky websites, just having an easier LLM style bot, in the same way we talk to ChatGPT that uses natural language that you can talk to get answers for things about government services. Like it might be as simple as that changes like a pretty profound thing for someone who could now like in a natural way can ask about government services and get access to something they never knew existed for them.
thank you so much, Joel. This is all we have time for today, unfortunately. Thank you for your presentation. Great book, great discussion. You can buy Joel's book in fine bookstores everywhere. Very many thanks to our audience for your excellent questions. Special thanks to our admin, Elke. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do follow us on social media and check back on our website to stay updated with our work. Thank you very much and goodbye.